What are some key steps and issues if you want to adopt a child here in Michigan? Find out next on Practical Law. Stay tuned. Welcome to Practical Law. I'm your host, divorce and family law attorney Henry Gornbein. I'm also pleased to say that Practical Law is now the official show of the Oakland County Bar Association. Today on Practical Law, we are going to be talking about an important topic, and that is adoptions, with my guest, adoption expert, Dion Roddy. Dion, welcome to Practical Law.
Thanks for having me, Henry. It's good to be here.
Thank you. First of all, Dion, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and your background?
Okay, well, it's a little bit of a convoluted pathway to adoption law for me. Grew up in West Michigan, moved here to Detroit when I was a young person in college. Actually pursued a music career for quite a few years, played professionally, wrote, toured, etc. Recorded a few albums, made a little bit of a splash, but eventually that doesn't fit with family life. So I found another career, worked in advertising for a while in production work. And about 5 or 6 years ago, my wife and I adopted our daughter. And I was fascinated with the process and had considered a law career in the past, but had an opportunity to go back to school for a second career. And my sole desire was to practice in adoption law. So several years later, and here I am. So
Tell us about the focus of your practice right now. As you said, it's adoption law, but what does that mean?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right, Henry. I practice exclusively in adoptions, which encompasses all kinds of adoptions, which we'll get into: direct placements, agency placements, step parents, relatives, guardianships, etc. But I also practice in another related field in adoption, assisted reproduction law, which gets into surrogacy, embryo donation, egg donations, things of that nature. It's a subset of family law in general.
You know, it's interesting. I'm thinking back, and a number of years ago, I had Noel Keane on this show, and he was like the father in Michigan of surrogate parenting issues, and he was the creator of the firm that you now are the head of.
Essentially, yes. In fact, my building in Dearborn, if you look at the top of the building, you'll see the sign, the Keene Law Firm. The sign is still there, and I have always asked, why haven't they taken the sign down? And it's just simply too heavy. And so it's kind of this monument to Noel Keane and all that he
probably
did.
Passed away, what, 10, 15 years ago, maybe?
Yeah, actually, he was, I think early 2000s is when he did that, when he did pass away.
Dion, what is adoption? Why don't we start with some basic definitions?
Well, adoption is the creation through a legal mechanism of creating a parent-child relationship. Naturally, we conceive children, women give birth to the children, fathers raise their children, mothers and fathers raise their children. They're biological children. Now, the court can do this through a legal means of creating a relationship with a child that's not related, or maybe related distantly, like a grandchild or a nephew or a niece. So, and sometimes even with a stepchild.
Dion, who can adopt?
Well, in Michigan, a single person or a married couple can adopt. Now, for a long time, there was no problem with this because there were only two types of people in the world: single people and married people. And when it came to children, a single person could take custody of a child, or a married couple could But as time has gone by, later in this century, we have same-sex couples, we have unmarried couples that want to raise children together. It's created more issues, and I know that the law has not been able to adjust to it very well. And so I know there were efforts early on to try to do second parent adoptions where two non-married people could adopt. This was primarily to accommodate same-sex couples, because at the time in Michigan they could not marry. But now, with Obergefell being passed, the Supreme Court ruling on Obergefell a couple years ago, it's really a moot point. So still in Michigan, single persons and married couples can adopt.
What are some of the types of adoptions?
Well, we have, as I mentioned earlier, probably the most common adoption, and when people think about an adoption, they think about an adoption agency. And agency placements are one type of adoption. That's the kind of the old-fashioned traditional, a mother gives birth to a child, an adoption agency takes custody of the child, her rights are terminated, and the agency finds some couple or a single person in their list of names and places that child. And there's no connection there between the biological parent and the adoptive parents. That's your kind of your old-fashioned method of adoption. But in 1995, Michigan law changed. Noel was involved with this, and another attorney, Herbert Braille, very instrumental in changing the law in Michigan to allow direct placement adoptions. And that's probably the most prevalent adoption that you'll see now these days. That's where a biological parent will have a child to place, and that adoptive parent will find an adoptive parent to actually take custody of the child. Now, a lot of times they'll use an agency to help them, but it's the actual biological parent that's doing the choosing. And this has opened the door to what are called open adoptions, where the biological parent maintains a relationship with the adopted child to a certain degree throughout the child's life. I mean, as much as continuing to visit the child, or as little as just getting some cards, some pictures once in a while. It's also, there's also semi-open adoptions, things of that nature. There's also adoptions for step-parents. A lot of times in adoptive or married couples, they divorce, they have children, one spouse remarries, and that spouse wants to adopt the child, especially if the new spouse has primary custody. So step-parent adoptions are real popular. Also, relatives can adopt. Sometimes a grandparent has to adopt because the biological parent of the child is not caring for the child very well or is unable to. Aunts and uncles often adopt nieces and nephews. And also guardianships. Sometimes a guardian will want to make that relationship permanent, and so they will seek an adoption of a child.
Dion, I'm thinking, and in child custody, there's a pecking order, which means there's a very strong presumption favoring natural parents over anyone else. And in a battle between natural parents and perhaps a grandparent or a step-parent or another relative, the natural parents are heavily favored. Is there any type of pecking order with regard to adoptions?
Well, with regard to like direct placements and agency placements, I mean, in any adoption, the biological parent is usually consenting to giving up their parental rights, and so, unless they do, then adoption is not going to happen. Now, there are instances where the law can involuntarily terminate situations of neglect or abuse, situations where legal parents have failed to support a child or failed to visit or maintain a relationship with a child over a 2-year period. We call it the 2-year rule. But I mean, the preference for a biological parent is extremely strong. And in fact, unless a biological link is made between a putative father, say, and and an adoptee, a potential adoptee, that father doesn't have the same rights as a legal father. The rights are diminished a great deal, and it's easier for his parental rights to be terminated. So,
Dion, is there any difference between a biological child and an adopted child?
absolutely not. It's the whole goal of adoption is to create this parent-child relationship, and in fact, the law, Michigan law, is very specific that once an adoption is finalized, the relationship between the parent and the child is the same as if the child were born to those parents, and so the child becomes an heir at law. The child is treated no differently from any other biological children that they may have. And on the same token, the parents are equally responsible for that child, for any medical issues, any legal issues that the child may become involved in. So literally no difference in the relationship whatsoever.
Where does a typical adoption take place?
Well, adoptions take place in the circuit court of the family division of the circuit court. So here in Oakland County, they take place in Pontiac at the 1200 building at Telegraph Road. Each circuit court has their own adoption department. Ideally, the bigger courts certainly have their own departments carved out: Wayne County, Oakland County, Macomb County, Washtenaw, throughout the whole southeastern Michigan area. Some of the smaller courts in the outlying areas will usually have a probate register, somebody a person designated to handle those adoptions. You know, obviously they're not dealing with as much casework there. So, but it happens in the circuit court.
What are the first steps? Let's say someone comes to you saying, "I'd like to adopt a child." What are the first steps in the process?
Well, for agency and direct placement adoptions, you need to have a home study. And a home study is essentially a review of the home environment, and it needs to be done by a child placing agency, an adoption agency. A licensed social worker needs to conduct it. They essentially scrutinize the home, look at the backgrounds of the parties, the income, criminal history. They do clearances. They really vet it out. In fact, I found it in my own adoption experience. It's easy to have children biologically, and they don't check you out for anything.
No.
But if you want to adopt a child, they run you through the ringer. Now, I don't want to discourage anybody because everybody has a story to tell. Nobody's past is perfect. So, you know, and certainly mine wasn't either. So when I went through the adoption process, you know, we're always worried about those little things in our past. Usually there's nothing to worry about. Most people get approved. Obviously, there are certain things in the law that would prevent you from adopting.
What are some things that would prevent an adoption?
Well, if someone is ever convicted of any sort of criminal sexual conduct towards children, I mean, very severe in cases where children should not be in the custody of certain people, or if a person has solicited a minor for immoral purposes. Other than those particular exceptions, it's all discretionary as far as who can be approved.
How long does a typical adoption take from start to finish?
In my experience, anywhere, I would say, and I tell my clients this, anywhere from 4 to 6 months if it's without event. I mean, if things become contested or something changes course dramatically, then we're looking at things stretching out to possibly a year or longer. And if there's appeals filed, then we're looking at even longer. I mean, I had a step-parent adoption that I filed last year. Looked like a pretty typical case here in Oakland County. We filed it. This was a situation where the non-custodial mother had not seen the child in like 3 years, had not paid any support, and she had some issues. And without getting into too much detail, she had some issues with how she treated the child. Well, when it came time for her to appear to appear whether or not she would consent or not. First, she was very, very much admitting, like, yeah, I'm going to consent to this. But When it came down to it, the referee asked her and she refused to consent. So that opened up the door essentially to a trial. And so she was appointed an attorney, and we did a full-blown evidentiary hearing on whether or not our allegations were true. We had to not only show that she had not supported the child or visited the child in 2 years, but that also it was in the best interest of the child that my clients be able to adopt. And I mean, the father was the biological father. He had remarried. So we went through 2 days of trial, and thankfully we got a good result. But we just finalized that adoption about a year after it was filed. So, and unfortunately, it was the costs were a little higher than what my clients were expecting, but they were very pleased with the result, and it was worth every penny to them. So,
well, it's a wonderful event when someone's able to adopt, obviously. What about, let's say someone comes to you for an adoption. What's the typical conversation? What are the typical issues that you and the client or potential client for an adoption will be discussing? Well,
we need to make sure they have a home study. And usually by the time they talk to me, they do. If not, I usually have to send them away or refer them to somebody that can help them get started. And usually by the time they see me, they've been matched with a child. So that work has been done. And then I sit down with them and I need to explain to them one of the most important things is the concept of at risk. In Michigan, until this adoption is finalized, it's the potential that it could not succeed, in that if the adoptive parents have obviously spent money, invested a lot of time and effort, and sweat into this, they may come away with nothing, and sometimes that's very hard for them to digest. But because of that parental presumption that you speak of, until those parental rights are terminated by the biological parent, and that can take several weeks, sometimes several months to accomplish, there's a potential for that parent to maintain those rights. So I have to explain to them the at-risk concept of at-risk to them. I also have to learn about whether there's any Indian heritage for the child, because federal and state law has special laws in place to protect Indian families. Indian Family Preservation Act here in Michigan and the Indian Child Welfare Act at the federal level. And this goes back to the history of how Native Americans their children were often removed from their families, put into boarding schools, and not allowed to maintain their culture, their language. So if an Indian child is involved, it becomes much more complicated. Tribes become involved, or at least they have the opportunity to become involved. And so if there's any Indian heritage involved with the biological mother or the child, I have to warn them about potential problems or complications there. I like to explain to them the idea of that the expenses involved with adoption are primarily theirs. I mean, that means paying for biological mother or biological parents' legal costs, their counseling fees. In Michigan, there's expenses, living expenses are allowed up to a certain point. So there's certain things that need to be covered at that point.
Is there any difference, Dion, between the adoption of an infant and the adoption of a child who might be 5 or 6 years of age, for example?
Slightly. I mean, if it's a direct placement adoption, it's the same process. The only difference is a recent change in the Michigan law has allowed, I can go back and explain that after parental rights have been terminated by a biological parent, the child is what's called formally placed. And at that point, that child is placed with the adoptive family. And supervision begins. There's a period of supervision where usually the agency has done the home study, will go to the home and check and make sure everything is going all right for a period of time. Now, it used to be generally that was a 6-month period, no matter the age of the adoptee, it didn't matter. It's always 6 months. So there's 2 or 3 visits, sometimes as many as 6 visits in that time. Well, Michigan law has allowed for a child, if the child is under 1 year of age, infant adoption, that period can be shortened to 3 months. So that usually cuts a little time off it. That's one difference. I mean, other than the fact, often if you're adopting older children, you're getting all of the life experience that child has acquired over those 5 years. And often older children are adopted through the foster system, and there's histories, because these children are state wards. There's often a history of neglect or abuse, emotional problems, mental health issues, physical issues, and those adoptions can be. That child can have a much more difficult time adjusting to an adoptive home. So I usually like to recommend some counseling and some preparation for taking a child of that nature in your home.
Dion, what about surrogate parenting?
Surrogate parenting it's another area that I work in. Surrogate parenting, surrogacy in Michigan, or a contract for surrogacy, is illegal in Michigan for a compensated surrogacy. Say if a couple they couldn't conceive on their own, they wanted to find a woman to gestate a child for them, either using their own sperm and their own egg or somebody else's through the magic of medical technology, they could not compensate her for that. And any contract of that nature is unenforceable in Michigan. So if you were to have a contract and somehow there was a breach, if you were to take it to a Michigan court, they would say, we don't even know what this is. We're not gonna mess with it. And in fact, there are some criminal penalties for people who are involved in paid surrogacy. And so we steer clear of that here in Michigan. Now, there is some legislation that's been proposed recently to try to put in a surrogacy bill that would be accepted, but at this point we're still working on that. Now, uncompensated surrogacy, on the other hand, is permitted in Michigan, and this is a situation where you have a friend or a family member who's willing to help out a couple by allowing to be a gestational carrier, and I help with those. We usually put we have a meeting with the parties. We make sure they get lots of counseling to understand exactly what they're doing. And then we have a way legally of ensuring that child being born to this woman, and sometimes this woman's married, we make sure that this husband and wife here are not the legal parents of that child, but that the intended parents they are declared by a court to be the legal parents.
But until the birth, don't they have to waive rights at birth? Sometimes isn't there a change of heart when the baby's born, or?
There's potentially that change of heart, and that's why we do this prior to the birth.
Okay.
It's called what is called a pre-birth order.
Okay.
And we file a complaint in the circuit court. It's an uncontested action. Every party wants the same result, the same relief, and so we file a complaint and an answer that all concurs. They stipulate to an order, and we present it to the judge. And most judges know about these orders and will sign the order, or they will seek, they may at an extreme end want to have a hearing of some sort to make sure that what is happening is actually the actual case. We have a few judges that have never seen this before and don't understand exactly what's going on, because it is a little bit of us using the Paternity Act to declare motherhood, and it's based on an equal protection argument. 14th Amendment. So without going into much detail in it, it's an interesting concept.
What about differences between in-state and out-of-state adoptions?
Well, in-state adoptions, everything is contained within the state. Once one of the parties is in another state, and we have a child that's in one state that's going to be adopted by a family in another state, another dimension is added to the legal side of this, because we're dealing with different states' laws. We're dealing with moving children between interstate lines. And so, thankfully, all the states have agreed to a body of law called the Interstate Compact for the Placement of Children, ICPC for short. And we use this law to communicate between the states, to ensure that that the sending state, like say Michigan, if we had a child here in Michigan, say we were sending that child over to California, that the ICPC office in Michigan communicates with the ICPC office in California and says, hey, there's an adoptive placement taking place. This child's going to be coming over to California. Everybody knows about this. Everybody knows why. There's a raft of paperwork that goes with it. And that child cannot leave the state of Michigan until both states agree to that. And so sometimes you have adoptive parents coming in after the birth of a child, and I tell them, plan on staying here for 10 days to 2 weeks till this gets approved.
Is this true with international adoptions? And I'm thinking I've had a lot of divorces where someone had adopted an infant from perhaps China or Russia or other countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, international adoption is another different aspect of adoption. It's not something I really work in. I really only work in domestic, interstate adoption. So it's a whole different set of laws. You're dealing with the Hague Convention. My only experience with international adoption came with an adoption in Nigeria. I had a family come to me. One of my first cases, in fact, a family came to me they were Nigerian nationals, but they were citizens in the United States, and they had gone to Nigeria and adopted a child. The adoption was final. The child was already legally theirs. The problem they were having was getting the child home to them. So this child, they had tried for 2 years to try to get this child home.
We're down to like 15 seconds. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. But needless to say, the big challenge was to work with with immigration to get the child home, and I was able to do that.
Dion, we're out of time. I wish we had more time. I'm going to have you back because there are a lot of issues we didn't cover, but I want to thank you for being my guest on Practical Law. I want to thank you for watching Practical Law.